Forbidden sex in the Middle Ages. Once upon a time, romantic relationships could lead to being burned at the stake, and intimate secrets were kept under the threat of death. Today, we will reveal shocking facts about sexual life in the Middle Ages and learn what punishments awaited those who dared to break the strict church laws. You are on the Artifacts of Mystery channel. Let's go! Welcome to the Middle Ages. Imagine that every romantic move you make, every passionate sigh, and even your most intimate thoughts about a loved one are under the strict scrutiny of the church. Yes, that's exactly how it was. In the Middle Ages, the theory of the ancient Roman physician Galen reigned supreme. This medical pope of the Middle Ages, who lived from 129 to 217, made significant contributions to anatomy, physiology, pathology, and many other sciences. His works were studied in medical universities everywhere, and even criminal courts were based on his theories. Galen believed that the female womb was cold and needed to be warmed by hot male semen. Moreover, if a woman did not engage in intercourse, her seed, according to Galen, would thicken and choke the womb, seriously damaging her health. Therefore, it was thought that women had a physical need for regular sex, and marriage was considered the most important means to satisfy the lusts of both women and men and to protect against fornication. John Gordon, a renowned medical luminary of early 15th century Oxford, recommended that women suffering from excessive desire find a man and marry as soon as possible. If this was not possible, they were advised to travel, exercise, and take medications. And if even this did not help, they should find a midwife who would relieve the tension with the help of oil and fingers. According to Galen's theory, for a woman to conceive, she needed to experience orgasm. Yes, people in the Middle Ages knew what that was and were not shy about discussing it. People back then were generally not very modest. They bathed naked, washed together in communal baths, and joked in ways that could make any modern vlogger blush. Galen's theory seems promising, given the high child mortality rate. The main goal of marriage was indeed to produce offspring, and it was believed that orgasm facilitated this. In the Middle Ages, the marital duty was not just a phrase. Spouses truly had to satisfy each other's physiological needs, which was considered extremely important for health. Refusal of marital intimacy could even be grounds for annulment. Even for married couples, everything was under strict control. The marital duty was not just a concept but a real obligation, but only if it was performed with the aim of procreation. The church established periods of abstinence, such as religious holidays, fasts, and even certain days of the month. For example, sexual relations were prohibited on Sundays, during Lent, on the eve of religious holidays, and during a woman's menstruation. As a result, intimate life was scheduled according to the calendar, and any deviations could lead to serious consequences. At that time, the Catholic Church was not just a religious organization but also a powerful regulator of all aspects of life, especially personal and intimate ones. Sexual relations were viewed exclusively through the lens of religion, and the primary purpose of sex was simple and straightforward: the birth of children. Everything else was considered a sin, and not just any sin, but a terrible, vicious act. Imagine that every action in your bedroom had to adhere to strict rules, or else you faced punishment. Forget about the freedoms and sexual experiments that we take for granted today. In the Middle Ages, any sexual acts not aimed at conception were considered unnatural and punishable. Masturbation? Sin. Oral sex? Definitely a sin. Anal sex? Oh, now that's a mortal sin on the horizon. Contraception? Don't even mention it, it was absolutely forbidden, as it contradicted the main goal of sex, procreation. If someone dared to break these strict rules, severe punishments awaited them. Adultery? It wasn't just a matter of a broken heart, it was a sin that could result in severe fasting, public confession, or even corporal punishment. Homosexual relationships? This could lead to the death penalty. And don't think these were just empty threats. The church and secular authorities worked in tandem to maintain moral order. Punishments included fines, confiscation of property, corporal punishment, and even excommunication from the church. So, what were the punishments for sexual sins in the Middle Ages? In the Middle Ages, sexual sins were strictly punished by both church and secular authorities. The punishments varied depending on the severity of the offense, the social status of the offenders, and local customs. Let's take a detailed look at the various types of punishments and provide some examples. Offenders were often required to undergo prolonged fasts and daily prayers. For example, for adultery, a person might be required to pray several times a day for several months. Pilgrimage to holy places was also a common form of punishment. Offenders were sent on long journeys to religious shrines as an act of penance and atonement for their sins. Corporal punishment, such as flogging, was another method employed to enforce adherence to moral standards. Additionally, public shaming, such as standing in the pillory, was used to deter others from committing similar offenses. In more severe cases, such as sodomy or repeated offenses, the punishments could be harsher, including mutilation or execution. The exact nature of the punishment often depended on the discretion of the local authorities and the church. Overall, the intertwining of religious doctrine and secular law ensured that the regulation of sexual behavior was a key aspect of maintaining social order in the Middle Ages. Sinners might be required to publicly confess their sins before the entire community. This was an act of humility and a deterrent to prevent others from committing similar offenses. Offenders could be obliged to wear special signs or clothing indicating their sin. For example, in England, adulterers might wear garments with letters sewn on, signifying their transgression. One of the harshest punishments was expulsion from the church community. The excommunicated could not participate in sacraments and were deprived of spiritual support. For example, in the 13th century, heretics and sodomites were often excommunicated and handed over to secular authorities for further punishment. For many sexual transgressions, monetary fines were imposed. For example, in some German cities, adultery could result in a fine payable to the city council. In cases of severe offenses, the property of the offenders could be confiscated. In 14th century England, the property of women accused of prostitution could be seized and handed over to local authorities. Corporal punishments were often applied for adultery, sodomy, and other sexual sins. For instance, in 16th century Scotland, women caught in adultery could be publicly whipped in the town square. In some cases, offenders were branded to permanently mark them as violators of societal norms. For example, in Spain, adulterers could be branded on the forehead or cheek. Offenders could be imprisoned for a set period. In 15th century Venice, adultery could result in several months of imprisonment. In certain instances, offenders were sent to hard labor, where they had to perform strenuous physical work. For example, in 18th century France, prostitution could lead to forced labor. In the most severe cases, such as sodomy, the death penalty was applied. In 14th century Italy, sodomites could be burned at the stake. Sexual sins were sometimes linked to accusations of witchcraft, which could also lead to the death penalty. In 17th century Germany, women accused of witchcraft and consorting with the devil were often burned at the stake. Here are a few examples of punishments. In 1395, in England, Margaret Poynting was accused of adultery. She was required to kneel before the altar of the local church for several hours each day for a month and publicly confess her sins. She also had to pay a significant fine to the local parish. Giovanni Bruni was accused of sodomy in the year 1476, in Italy. He was subjected to corporal punishment and then branded with the letter S on his forehead. After this, he was expelled from the city and forbidden to return under the threat of death. In Germany, in the year 1620, Anna Wald was accused of witchcraft and engaging in prostitution. She was tortured to extract a confession and then burned at the stake. All her property was confiscated and handed over to local authorities. The punishments for sexual sins in the Middle Ages were diverse and often extremely severe. The church and secular authorities worked together to maintain moral order and control people's behavior. These measures, aimed at preventing sins and maintaining social norms, created an atmosphere of fear and submission but also demonstrated how seriously moral and ethical issues were taken at that time. But despite all the prohibitions and strict norms, love always found its way. Knights and ladies arranged secret meetings, exchanged love letters, and gifts. Knightly tournaments often became arenas for demonstrating feelings and loyalty to their ladies. Knights dedicated their victories to their fair ladies, who, in turn, inspired them to new feats. Age-old legends of Tristan and Isolde or Lancelot and Guinevere are not just stories of love, they reflect people's desire for romance and passion, despite all obstacles.